design. So nobody can be opposed, according to the Brundtland Commission. It says that nobody can be opposed to a person pursuing his or her economic interest in a sustainable manner, as long as it satisfies the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of the future generation satisfying their own. But acceptance of this understanding says that it says there's nothing specific regarding the content. Tikati sustainability, which area have been put into play that a specific person can say, why this is sustainable? It becomes challenging because what can be sustainable depends on the amount of resources that are available. So when you are looking at water resources, right, you are engaging in high-end agricultural practices. Malinga na madzi amene is available in your area, it would be sustainable. So if the person also employs that very mechanism in a country where there's high water stress, it will not be sustainable. They are looking at a global perspective. So that becomes conflictual because the person will argue that these are economic interests that are in a sustainable manner, but in the long run, it is going to affect people. So people who can all generally agree with a statement can still compete further on a diametrical opposing aims. So the issue there in terms of sustainable as a mere design is, what is the aim of the economic interest? Is it, as we go back to attitudes, environmental attitudes, you look at, for example, is it an egoistic aim, right? Is it altruistic? So because of this, it determines whether or not that sustainable practice is going to benefit a large amount of people, or it's not, it's only going to benefit a single individual or just a specific region. And the second meaning is sustainability as an ideological illusion. So ideological would just mean a way or process of interpreting and thinking about a specific concept. So the concept of sustainability conceals in the manner of conflict of interest among real actors. Being ideological, we look at the conflict of interest that arises in terms of people who are in power. The danger in each social actor and group may decline in its own sustainability. So people who are in power, depending on a specific area, will look at how it becomes conflictual in ideology, where we are looking at specific actors such as, for example, farmers and industries, or people who are in social movements or political parties, including those who are in authority and others. It becomes specifically conflictual where the actors are not agreeing on the best measure of sustainability in their area. So a farmer would look at, for him to be sustainably engaging in practices, he must generally make the most amount of profits, right? Engaging with resources that will give him the most amount of benefit. But when you are looking at these resources, you find that mu industry, akoza wabanga bani ma farmers against using other chemicals, right? Pamene ma chemicals ajaga gwisa ntchito the farmer, it gives him abundance in harvest. But so you can see that it becomes conflictual where the farmer wants to make profit. And when they ban specific products in increasing his agricultural yield, it affects his yield in the long run. So it becomes conflictual. For example, this happened in Norway, where there was a conflict between the farmers and the industry in use of specific farming chemicals, where farming chemicals, they are affecting the environment. So they had to ban them. Komano, that chemical was the only way in which the farmers could make high yield. So they have to balance these issues. My farmers, they went on a strike and so on, but that was something that they couldn't win. It becomes challenging. And also issues such as social movements and political parties, as well as authorities. And all of them could then claim to promote sustainable development, but with using diverging or contradictory understanding of what sustainability is. Sustainability ya farm and the should increase yield. Sustainability ya industry, we should reduce the amount of chemicals that we are using that affect the environment. So it becomes conflictual again. So Adaima Bakoti, all of them would say, you know, this is sustainable according to practice. And the third and last meaning of sustainability that brings around conflict is sustainability as a utopian hope. So if sustainability should be used as a collective designation of everything, hopeful, helpful, and good, then it would be impractical. It would be impractical. It is impractical because it is not possible for all activities to be good for everyone, right? But sustainability, okay, fine, we are developing a specific area to benefit this certain amount of people. The reality is development in many ways is going to hinder a certain amount. So it's impracticable for development in terms of sustainable to be good and helpful for everyone, because it depends on the context and needs of specific people. It cannot be possible for sustainability to benefit everyone in the same way. So this could lead to a random personal conclusion and would arouse expectations which cannot be fulfilled, where as countries will say sustainable development is going to benefit everyone. The reality is, when you're looking at SDG number 1, no poverty, SDG number 2, zero hunger, do you think it's possible for a country to get to a point where there's zero hunger, especially right? It's not practical, even although they say we're streamlining SDGs. Is it possible for countries that are war-torn to get to a point where there's no conflict? So it becomes challenging for countries to experience this sense of sustainability, and it's impracticable for those sustainable development goals to 100% be fulfilled by assimilation of the SDGs. So after determining the meanings of sustainability that brings about conflict, we are going to look at the types of environmental conflict. The first type of environmental conflict is demarcation. So demarcation is coming in from design. The subject area of principal sustainability should be applied and what it does not. When you are looking at responsibility of the future generation in terms of distributive justice. So you can see that the field of application, for example, that sustainability rules are formulated not as a sum of all desirable social goals, but a minimum of the requirement of lastingly humane existence. We are not formulating sustainable development goals based on all social desirable goals. It cannot be possible for that, because my desirable social goals are depending on the country, the context, and also their priorities. And when you are looking at the question of conservation of development, it also depends on the context as well as the country. So the demarcation is very challenging, because a country can only assimilate this level of development or this level of conservation based on the resources that they have, the priorities, and the challenges that they face in regards to environmental threats and so on. And the second is conflict about sustainability of different parts of overall social capital. So in terms of maintaining sustainability, we look at a cohesion of the social capital in terms of the productive potential of a generation. So in order for a generation to be productive at its most highest, they look at having a consolidation of natural capital, the real capital. So the natural capital would be the natural resources. The real capital would look at the finances that a country has. For example, currency, right? And human capital would include the skills that are available in terms of the humans that are there. For example, in terms of our human capital, what are the highest skilled individuals, or what are the consolidation of all the highest skilled individuals? We find that how many they are skilled in Roje, right? And how many have been of school as comparing to the population, right? And how many have been of school in Dojeba. And knowledge capital looks at the information that has accumulated in that specific country that drives development. So sustainable development demands in general that the stock of all of these 4 levels of capital exist within a generation and to be handed down in the most undiminished as possible to the future generation. You find that when you are looking at natural capital, real capital, particularly when you're looking at natural capital. It's not possible for the future generation to get the natural capital as undiminished as possible. Because when you're looking at 50 years ago, Malawi did not have the natural resources. When you're looking at now, Malawi does not have the natural resources that it had 50 years ago. Yet we had to make sacrifices in order to make development. And for many, in the next 10 years, you hear kuti miyala ijaran yata. So it means that future generation will not be able to capitalize on those natural resources to bring about productive potential or development. So the third is conflicts over priorities. That is very obvious. Priorities in countries are different. Priorities in the same country will also be different. So these mutually related differences include ecological priority, economic, social, and political. So these are under, all of them under the dimension of sustainability. So careful consideration weighs the priorities are very important. So proposed approaches to sustainability in various dimensions will not always be mutually reinforcing of each other, which will create a win-win situation. It can't be a win-win because the moment you are making or prioritizing economic development, ecological conservation suffers. The moment you are prioritizing social development, so economic development will suffer. And the moment you are prioritizing political stability, you'd find that maybe economic development will suffer. So it can't be in a situation where all aspects of priorities in a country would engage a win-win, but rather priorities have to be based on the development plan of a country, development plan of a region, and overall development plan of the world. So tikangana sustainable development goals, we said kuti it provides assistance to the countries that are worse off. Right? That is the goal of the SDGs. So in a country where there is the most amount of hunger, it means the assistance, international assistance, iambirire the most amount ipite in those countries. So issues such as maybe economic output have to be reduced, have to suffer in order for social development to be improved. So it's not possible in terms of sustainable development to award countries or individuals to be able to have a win-win situation. And conflicts over choices of indicators. So when you are looking at the conflict, this one, conflict over priorities, my priorities, I mean, mapanga create, they generally must have indicators. But the reality is, different countries might have relatively the same priorities, but the indicators might also be different. So therefore, it's very difficult to create a unified indicator system. So rather than different indicators creating a set of different accents, determination of indicators influences further questions on the parameters chosen for example, long-term observation, and parameters chosen for a more neutral and short-term observation. A very good example would be if sustainable development goals, as I taught them, they were just a summary of what the SDG says. It doesn't give you a narrative of the specific policies that are underneath there. So if you are looking at a sustainable development goal suggesting that, for example, no poverty, right? No poverty would suggest that maybe by 2026, all countries must be living above $1.50 a day, right? But that indicator is very conflictual because you are looking at countries that maybe were living at 50 cents a day. So by 2026, mwina akwelako kufika pajani 90 cents, right? That suggests that there is actual improvement. So in using an indicator that just has a generalization, gives the prospect of suggesting that some countries are not doing well, when in reality they have shifted from being worse off to actually functioning at a milder level of sustainability. So it would include such as the ozone, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. So for example, reducing the Paris Agreement suggests we have to reduce the world temperature by 1.5. Komano, what if we are by 2026 we are at 1? It would still suggest that there is some progress in the Sustainable Development Agreement. So these conflicts also make clear the conflicts over sustainability are not may not always occur, and often the strategic level of measures are not realized. So this just explains how the measures and indicators that have been stipulated through sustainable development, it might be challenging for them to be realized. And when they are not realized, the report will give in a negative outcome of the consequence, which does not properly bring in the changes that have occurred in that specific country. So for example, if we're saying, Kuti, if a country that is not doing well in terms of poverty would stop receiving a certain amount, if the amount has not crossed over a specific year, it would suggest that countries will stop benefiting from international aid because they have not reached the indicator that was stipulated in the policy documents, which would be unfair because it would deter the process of sustainable development. And finally, conflicts over distribution. So the key issue in distribution translates the issues of sustainable development responsibility. It translates the issues of sustainable development responsibility. So when, for example, one has to decide between the contribution of transportation industry and power supply industry should bring towards the national O2 reduction target, it becomes challenging in terms of the distribution of those areas, supposing that a country cannot shift towards, for example, hydroelectric power, but it also cannot shift to electric vehicles. So it becomes challenging for those countries in terms of distribution to change the course and channel of their distributive actions in the long run. So quite a substantial conflicts of interest flare up, and it could be observed, for example, in the Cairo Follow-up Conference. The Cairo Follow-up Conference looked at how countries had agreed on common goals on sustainable development, but they were unable to meet the requirements. So when you see this, it suggests how, for example, the United States was the highest emitter of CO2s, but did not meet the requirements of the follow-up agreement in the Kyoto Protocol. So on the other hand, the conflicts of distribution arise because of the winner-loser problem. So it is there because countries generally will not come to a consensus of addressing countries that are going to be worse off in the distribution patterns of sustainable development. For example, if we are streamlining the electric vehicles, if that streamlining was to be done, it means that countries that are still using the carbon-based or fuel-based cars would be on the loser end and experience backlash within the conference agreements that have been made in sustainable development. And furthermore, it looks at fitness of scarce resources such as drinking of water as well as soil in terms of fertile soil or degraded soil. So those are the 5 types of conflicts of sustainable development. So now we look at the comparative narrative of the conflict. So there are different types of sustainability conflict, as we have mentioned. But the basis of them comes within the diversity of the conflicts and a society that is pluralistic, because generally the society that we live in, people have different priorities, they have different responsibilities, and it is the role of the welfare and the state as well as the economic system to consolidate these needs differently and to ensure that justice is enabled for all population to experience. For example, there's just a system of tax. So we have the tax-based system in controlling environmental effects. So a tax such as carbon tax, how does a country distribute or redistribute that carbon tax in ensuring that those people that are worse off or those that can experience the most effects of climate change are given some sort of assistance in ensuring that they are more resilient. And furthermore, as you look at the question of justice, it gives you the essence of sustainability, where going beyond a small nation, a regional circle, and the present generation, brings in a global scale of the future generation. So as I pointed out earlier, do we forfeit the development of this current generation, making reference to a future generation that will never meet? So this is a challenge of reflection in terms of justice and equity. What provision are we giving for the future generation if we are unable to give it for the current generation right now? So the conflict between assumed needs and the interests of the future generation becomes a problem of knowing enough about them to be considered a sustainable manner. And the interests of the people living today become a constant issue, where if we are forfeiting the interests of the people living today, talking about a generation that is to come, we will renounce the realization of the needs in favor of the future generation that will probably will never meet, or a global social incidents can occur, such as COVID-19, which would cause maybe a great chunk of the population to die because of such a pandemic. So the global dimension of sustainability leads to a more narrow contact of different traditions, cultures, attempts to arrive at a common understanding of development. So the comparative analysis gives to us how development has to be structured, taking into consideration the differences or a pluralistic society that exists, understanding that there are different needs, and the structure of development, taking into consideration sustainable development, will be structured in preference to those that a country sees as most fit and most significant. And hence the solution in this respect will require identifying the explicit and implicit contradiction in the divergence between different cultures and conflict mentioned above, dealing with them in a more constructive way. So we are saying that the conflicts that have been identified in sustainable development have to take into consideration the differences between the society. And once we have made reference to the meanings that we talked about in the consolidating the meaning of sustainability and taking into account the differences between the society, we come up with measures or approaches in which they can be used to deal with this conflict in a more constructive way, where in the long run, we don't deal with these problems again. So there are two specific conflict resolution mechanisms. The first is the naturalistic conflict management. And number two is the culturalistic conflict management. So naturalistic just looks at the nature using scientific methods and applying conflict resolution through identified empirical evidence, while the naturalistic looks beyond scientific knowledge but also takes into consideration societal discourses. Normative reflection will also play an important role. So you find that depending on the environmental conflict that has been identified. So for example, if you are looking at conflict over distribution, right? Conflict over distribution would look into account mainly the culturalistic conflict management, where we are basing scientific knowledge, also engaging individuals in communications through societal discourse and normative reflection. So I'll explain the first naturalistic approach. So it is based on the assumption and brings the empirical evidence on that assumption in regards to the relationship between the society and the environment. So it looks at tolerance in terms of the limits where we are exceeding them, the exceeding limits of the relationship between the society and the environment. So the key role is ascribed in the integrative modeling. So for us to come up with imperative evidence of the relationship that occurs between the environment and the society and the effects that are coming in based on the activities that are there, they have to come up with a modeling and a simulation interaction that occurs. So they'll bring in specific societal activities and how they would affect specific areas in the environment. So they would bring in a coordination of different environmental activities and societal activities, bringing in and finding measures in which one affects the other. When they have done that, they'll be able to come up with an objective standard for sustainability, and this would be formulated taking into account the societal conflict. So what that means is, when they come up with a simulation, depending on the most prevalent conflict, for example, if you are looking at the conflict of distribution, they would simulate the conflict of distribution on the interaction that occurs between the society and the environment, and come up with a formulation of how the effects of distribution can affect the environment in the long run. For example, if one area or one region overuses a specific resource, or for example, if one area or specific several coastal regions over pollute the coastal lines, you would see that that would affect another area within the coastal line again. So, and you are looking at things such as fast fashion that affects underdeveloped countries in how to dispose these things, and such as disposal of mechanical and electric equipment. So through this distribution, and they come up with a simulation, they formulate objective mechanism in which conflicts can be addressed. So the question here looks at scientific methods being either necessary or unnecessary based on the problem in which the naturalistic approach is taking into consideration. And the last approach is the culturalistic approach. So the culturalistic approach is more prevalent in issues that affect the community because it takes into account the differences in culture. There are differences in terms of societal values, differences in priorities based on the problems that have been identified in specific countries. So the first approach under the culturalistic approach is the political decisionist approach. So this is an approach used under culturalistic where they leave the decision in societal conflicts to political system. So for example, using legal frameworks, political appointing on the policies that can be used to address these conflicts. And the second approach is the discursive participative approach. So it takes into consideration societal communication, where they engage different stakeholders that are affected by developmental projects, sustainable development, to come up with a consensus on the best way in which those developmental projects can be addressed. The example that I gave here, the oil deposits in Lake Malawi. In using this approach, they would come in together as different stakeholders to see what is the best way in which we can address either exploitation or conservation of this area. And lastly is the ethical or justice theoretical approach. In order to address conflict, it is sometimes more imperative to use the ethical principles. For example, the ethical principles of the right that individuals have, the right to having a clean environment. So, for example, that specific right of the right to having a clean environment, it is always imperative where countries are addressing the issues of conflicts or sustainable development, where they weigh the effects that these development practices are going to have in terms of the ethical principle that has been used. For example, the rights that individuals in a community can have. So these approaches have strengths and weaknesses. So because of this, there's no simple approach to the solution of all of the problems, but their solutions would require a combination of different approaches from one case to the other. So depending on a specific case, it would favor more the political decisionistic. For example, in a situation where conflict, for example, the people are not knowledgeable, the people don't have the relevant skills, it is always imperative to use the political method, because if we have allowed people to represent us by authority, they can make decisions for a grand amount of population. So in conclusion of this unit is that the constructivist conflict management is a communicative pursuit. It's communicative because it engages in dialogue to ensure that people come up with a consensus on what is going to be the path in regards to sustainable development. So conflict management can be made by argumentation or bargaining. So by different forms of negotiation and mediation and by participative approach. So with this, in this respect, the integrative concept of sustainable development provides some advice in which the direction of such communication procedures should be developed and applied through sustainable conflicts. So that is through supporting those types of sustainable communication patterns and following issues relevant in respect to, for example, the society's ability to respond. So when you are looking at the society's ability to respond, sometimes in regards to sustainable development, it can show us that there are potential conflictual issues in, for example, agreeing to sustainability, but the society might not respond to this. And the society's reflexivity. So this looks at the reflex that a society experiences. For example, being resilient or being responsive towards the issue during the time of a natural disaster. And self-organization. How does a society regulate itself to develop organizations that promote sustainable development and the balance of power? Balance of power is specifically important in looking at conflicts, particularly between regional and global level. When you are looking at, for example, my policies are sustainable development, body, is there enough representation by underdeveloped countries where they can bargain for mechanisms to employ these policies that are more relevant according to their context? So this balance of power obviously will bring in conflict, and there has to be a mechanism in which this can be addressed by promoting more regional and local approaches to sustainable development as opposed to the international preferences. So this concludes the conflicts in sustainable development, and that is unit 4 of module 3. So we move on to unit number 5, which is examining the Malawi Environmental Management Act. So this is the 1996 Act and has experienced several amendments in 2016 and 2017. So by examining this act, we are looking at the key principles or the general principles that have been outlined in the act and how they are prevalent or necessary in regards to the environmental challenges that Malawi face, firstly, and secondly, how the act has been put into practice as a case study that I'm going to use of the ban of single-use plastics. So to introduce the act looks at the several preliminary technical terms. So with every act or any policy or any document that is a guideline or a framework has to use interpretation of policies, interpretation of terms that are going to be frequent in the document. There are several terms, about 40, but I just use 2 specific ones. So the first one is effluent. So it means water waste or other fluid originating from a domestic or agricultural or industrial activity, whether treated, untreated, whether discharged directly or indirectly into the environment. So we look at how, for example, there are sewage systems. There are countries that have got specific policies on sewage systems and other waste, water wastes. And the second is environmental audit. So this means the systematic documentation and periodic and objective evaluation of the protection and management of the environment. So they would go through developmental projects to identify and document as well as evaluate methods that have been used in protecting and managing the environment in the exploitation that development does on natural resources. So they are the general principles under this act. The first is the natural environmental policy. So this is a driver of the act. It is a framework used for the act to be in practice. And the national environmental policy looks at the necessity for every individual to bring in appropriate measures to protect and manage the environment through sustainable utilization of natural resources in accordance with the Act. So it suggests that the Act, on top of it, has got the definition or the definitive terms. Underneath it, we have the policy that is used as a framework for the Act to be in function or to be streamlined in specific industries. And underneath that, we have the general subsection of written law in terms of performance of power and protection. So it is the requirement for everyone to exercise power and perform functions related to protection, management of the environment, and shall take steps and measures are necessary for, first of all, protecting a clean environment in Malawi, to ensure sustainable utilization of natural resources, and C, facilitating the restoration, maintenance, enhancement of the ecological system, D, promoting public awareness, participation in formulation and implementation of environmental conservation policies of the government, and E, promoting cooperation with foreign governments and international or regional organizations in protection of the environment, and F, promoting scientific research. So this provides action and mandate for government agencies, particularly the person that has been awarded the chairmanship position for the enacting of the environmental policy. So underneath the policy looks at the administrative powers. So the administration looks at the duties, first of all, of the minister, who the minister, like any other ministry under any act, looks at the key function under this is to promote and protect the management of the environment. So the minister shall, in consultation with lead agencies, take such measures as necessary for achieving the objective of the act. So it is imperative for the minister to coordinate with other agencies. So the reason why we are coordinating with other agencies is normally my minister are politically appointed, and many of them might not be knowledgeable in that specific ministry. With the natural resources, which with a lot of disciplines, they are very wide. Ama toka wote muntu janabanga, let's say, we can say natural resource management, but they majored, let's say, in water supply. So you find something like this where the person might not be knowledgeable on all environmental issues. That is why it would be relevant for him to consult with lead agencies that have specific expertise in addressing consolidation of all environmental related issues. So his administrative functions also includes for him to appoint a director of environmental affairs. So that director of environmental affairs works with the minister to address these general guiding principles under the policy. So the appointment of the director has to be a person who is qualified. So qualified in respect to environmental and sustainable development, responsible to the minister, functions to implement policies in the act, and furnish a council which is besides him. So when you are looking at the organogram, we have the minister, we have the director of environmental affairs, and next to him is the council. And establishing of composition of the National Council of the Environment. So the National Council of Environment, after having the director of environmental affairs that have been appointed by the minister, it also has to have the chairperson appointed by the president and recommended by the minister. So you see that with something like this, it's challenging with to engage environmental sustainability because mainly they are politically appointed. Because if a person is politically appointed, they are not in the best position to run that specific ministry. And be in the National Council, there also has to be the secretary of the president and cabinet, or the principal secretaries, the general manager of not only the Malawi Bureau of Standards, but the National Herbarical Botanical Garden of Malawi and several other statutory corporations. And the functions of the council shall regulate its own activities. However, the council is expected to have a technical committee on the environment. So this technical committee examines any specific issues referred to it by the minister, the council, and the director, or any lead agencies related to acts in the policy. So for example, the technical committee, it has been tipped off kuti malo ajasa kuyendera ma policies many the act stipulates. And underneath the technical committee, we have the district development committee. So this is important because every district has got specific environmental issues, and the lead in the district is the environmental officer. So this concludes the administrative function, and it is useless for an administrative function to be there without environmental planning. So planning is done in regards to the programs of social and economic development of the country. And it is done both nationally and from a district level in accordance with the action plan. And number 5 under the Act is there shall be environmental impact assessments, audits, and monitoring of all developmental projects in the country. So it means kuti imene imakhala task ya the technical committee. And number 6 is environmental quality standards. So the minister, on the advice of the council, prescribes environmental quality standards. So for example, the quality of air, water, soil, vibration, radiation, effluent, and solid waste. And number 7, environmental management. So it addresses incentives to promote environmental management through assistance, for example, through the Ministry of Finance or other agencies, and taking into consideration environmental protection of access to genetic resources, waste management, license of waste, import and export of hazardous waste, classification of pesticides and other substances for protection. So environmental management is very important when you are looking at incidences where maybe we are overexploiting the genetic resources. So indeed there has to be access, and there also has to be regulation in terms of waste management. Kuti company ngati abanga kani ma products how ma waste that they develop from the production process should not just be dumped anyhow, but they have to go through a specific process to protect the country as well as the citizens. Pollution control. 9 is inspection, analysis, and records. So every institution, including development, goes through an inspection process. So because of this, it allows for specific industries to be more integral in their process and more transparent because they go through an inspection process. Sangangolemba ba document, but the technical committee goes through the inspection of their industry. As we go along, I'm going to give you the case study of the plastic issue. So for example, if a company says we are making plastics that are more than 0.6 millimeters, but the technical committee goes through the production process and finds that is actually not true. Apita ku market ndukapezona kuti ma plastic amene anapangidwa brand ku company na amene they are, for example, the smallest millimeters. So this is an effective control by government. And environmental fund, offenses that are categorized in terms of the effects to the environment, legal proceedings in regards to the offenses, and finally miscellaneous provision. So the miscellaneous provision where gives reference to where the director believes on reasonable grounds that the act or any regulations made under thereunder have been contravened. So the director is under this subsection to order the closure of the premises by the means related to the contravened committed. So you see that it gives a reference to how the minister has got power, including the director, to close off premises that are against the line of the standards that have been stipulated by government. So the case study of Malawi gives us household consumption. And we have identified there is a lot of household consumption that are thrown on the riverside, thrown in dumpsters, but waste management system is severely in shortage in Malawi. So the Malawi Environmental Act, which is the 1996, looks at specific areas such as littering and licensing of people that do storage, waste disposal. And furthermore, several policies in regards to clean environment, duty to promote this, and environmental management waste. So the first and single most important factor in regards to Environmental Management Act is looking at how Malawi in 2015 became the first country to implement the ban on plastic bags. So following the global concern about environmental damage caused by single-use plastics. So you'd see that in that time, it was through this specific regulation that they ban not only the importation, manufacturing, trade, and commercial distribution of plastic bags that are less than 60 micrometers in thickness. So that was exemption of other areas such as medicine, veterinary products, and so on. However, in 2016, the Plastic Manufacturers Association appealed to the High Court to restrain the government from implementing the ban and review the ban, arguing that it would lead to job loss in the sector. So when you're looking at that reason in terms of the appeal, how do you think it's necessary? Kabena, how relevant is it for them to have a reason of saying, "Maplastic that is and who they are going to lose their job," right? It was just a way for the Plastic Manufacturers Association to go around the law system to lift the ban on single-use plastics. So in 2020, however, it was found that two companies, OG Plastics and Cite Plastics, were still manufacturing plastic bags despite the ban and were forced to close, while local environmental groups have called for strengthening enforcement given the presence of plastic bags in the market. There are still single-use plastics, eh? And you find that the Magampana Wanga Karabuti were forced to close, Gumanu, you know, they still continued. So this is coming in the acts of the regulation of the policy. How effective is the policy in terms of the minister, the director of the technical committee? They should not be, for example, taking bribes and allowing for these companies to still maintain its production and polluting the country. So the government indicates in the 2021 plan to completely ban single-use plastics, but have not taken this forward since then, and withstands the target of substantially reducing waste generation by 2030 in the Sustainable Development Goal number 12. So it has been seen that cities are key actors. Cities are key actors in implementing these policies. Cities are the reason why they are key actors in implementing these policies, because if cities unify and address the issues of sustainable development, including waste generation, waste disposal, and filling the gap in terms of coordination between waste generation, which is the households, and the industries, the waste collectors, it is important for them to work together to address this issue of waste that has infiltrated many countries. So the local authorities face, however, challenges in fulfilling their duties for waste collection because of issue of financial muscle and so on. So given the global trend, Malawi will also be well placed in extent to ban from bags of all single-use plastics, but it has been shown that it has not really been effective. So the challenge with that is the problem with advocacy campaigns, engaging both public and private stakeholders, streamlining the policies in all institutions, and providing effective pro-environmental attitudes actions that result in behavior, social, and institutional change. Any questions? So this remaining time, I'm just going to go over the last unit, the last module of the course. That way we focus on revision for the end of semester exams. What? 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 No, we have to start it now. We won't have time. We won't have time. Because I would feel like the focus of next week's lesson should be the revision. Because in the ndikazakonda pusa wambi revision is muzamva, which is the important part of next week's lesson. Then for me to have most of the lesson done now, that was supposed to be done next week. The other content in Diojeba wambi. So the last model of environment and sustainable development looks at the challenges and priorities for action towards sustainable global system. So the first that we'll cover today is the environmental conservation and control. We talked about environmental conservation in one of the first topics, right? So this part is going to go over very easy in terms of the content that is there. The only thing that we're going to look at is some of the conservation mechanisms. By definition, we looked at conservation being planned and control exploitation of natural resources. And in that previous lesson, I talked about several reasons for conservation. It is important for conservation to be streamlined because we look at the natural resources that are being distracted. We want to preserve species. We want to preserve natural beauty. We want to be able to recycle scarce minerals and resources, prevent destruction of the natural ecosystem. So there are key concepts of sustainable, of environmental conservations that I did not discuss in the previous lesson thoroughly. However, environmental conservation, as we said, is just the process of protecting the ecosystem, plants and animals, and all natural resources. And the main goal is to maintain a healthy environment for current and future generations. So the key focus on environmental conservation looks at biodiversity conservation, so survival of species and ecosystem, natural resource management, use of the natural resources that are available, that we already determined that most of them are finite and require management, and also climate change mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emission, which we identified as the reason why there are effects or impacts of climate change. And finally, pollution control in terms of managing waste and pollutants to minimize environmental damage. And the second is environmental control. Environmental control involves measures taken to regulate human activity. So aliyese ngatanga batsidwa ufulu utazibanga yese imena kufuna would see that the environmental conservation won't work, and it will end up affecting some who experience further impacts of climate change and effects to the environment. So the environmental control covers several areas. The first is regulation of emission and pollutants, which we saw in the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, under the Agenda 21, there are elements of that. Land use and planning, resource extraction limits that have been globally used, and also waste management. So that is has been also used globally in terms of proper disposal, recycling, treatment of waste, and reduce the impact of the ecosystem. This is specifically in terms of environmental conservation and control in waste management because of the movement of goods that is happening in a lot of countries. So tikakauti kupanga import katundu amene timagula, is there a system of waste management that is used and ensures that the environment is not affected by the economic exchange that occurs? So there are key aspects of environmental conservation and control. The first is protected areas and wildlife reserves. So we are looking at protecting the areas of wildlife and reserves, including having national parks, wildlife reserves, and marine sanctuaries. So these regions are often established to preserve ecosystem from human interference, allowing the wildlife to thrive in their natural habitats. So this includes, as I said, the national parks that are in a lot of countries, marine protection areas, and wildlife corridors, which are the natural passageways that connects protected areas, allowing species to move between different habitats. So the protected areas not only support biodiversity, but they also contribute to ecotourism, generating revenue while promoting conservation efforts. And number two is sustainable resource management. This is very important, understanding that the resources that are available are finite, and it aims to balance human needs with a long-term viability of the natural resource. So this involves using resources at a rate that does not deplete or degrade them. So it includes the sustainable forestry, the sustainable agricultural practices that I've talked about in depth, the sustainable fisheries, and you'd see that these strategies are critical in preventing resource depletion, ensuring ecosystems can regenerate, and maintaining a balance between human needs and environmental health. And number three is pollution prevention and control. So those are some of that number three just shows the aspects that are included in environmental control. So pollution prevention and control is self-explanatory in terms of protecting air, water, and soil quality through air pollution control, using technologies such as the catalytic converters and renewable energy sources to implement and reduce pollutants such as the carbon dioxide and the sulfur dioxide and so on. Water pollution control, which uses water waste treatment plants to reduce the effluents that are put into the water bodies and the natural environment. And soil pollution by controlling chemical pesticides, fertilizers in agriculture, and promoting organic farming. So you find that in a lot of countries, they have implemented this through providing incentives for organic farming. And number four is deforestation and reforestation. So deforestation mechanism uses ways to to plant back in large scale the areas that have been deforested, while the afforestation mechanism has been employed in countries by creating a forest ecosystem for areas that have not predominantly had plants and trees, to improve the ecosystem, to promote carbon capture, and protect water cycles. So this has been done in sub-Saharan deserts and several areas where the sub-Saharan desert is extending to. And number five is the water conservation. So in the previous lesson, I identified that there's water stress in a lot of the countries, and with increased global warming, we don't have enough water supply, with reduction in the rainfall that is occurring. So water conservation can be done through efficient irrigation, rainwater harvesting, and restoration of wetlands and rivers. So that is through, again, the afforestation mechanism. And climate change and mitigation is number six, which reduces greenhouse gas emission in the issue of addressing climate change in mitigation, and adaptation to to climate change acceleration through building flood defenses, creating drought-resistant crops, developing early warning signs, and coastal regions may need to prepare for rising sea levels because of the melting solar caps. So international agreements such as the Paris Agreement aim to limit global temperatures to rise and promote efforts to adapt climate change impacts. Number 7 is environmental education and awareness. All of the things that we have talked about, they will be useless if there isn't enough environmental education and awareness. Environmental conservation heavily depends on public engagement and awareness through education, communities, and through environmental education in schools being incorporated from early years, and community-based initiatives such as the community-based resource management